The existence of God can be known with certitude by the natural light of human reason. That means no faith required. There's many different ways in which someone can come to know of the existence of God. Some ways giving probable knowledge and some ways giving certain knowledge. The argument I give in this series, I claim, gives certain knowledge. It's a kind of argument that's traditionally referred to as a metaphysical demonstration. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals in existence as such, and the most fundamental principles of reality. And the term demonstration simply refers to an argument that is neither probabilistic nor merely an argument to the best explanation, but an argument where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. Two notes before we begin. First, the principles used in this argument are more fundamental than any kind of empirical science and would remain true regardless of what the scientific facts turn out to be. This also means that this argument is not empirical evidence in the relevant sense of the term. One of the most common objections to this kind of argument is that it simply can't work right out the gate because it's not empirical science, and that the only path to knowledge is by way of the empirical sciences. This is an objection we'll return to after the demonstration. The second thing to note is that the argument I give does not rest on any kind of Christian doctrine or divine revelation. In this sense, we can say that the argument is logically independent from Christianity. And this has two consequences. The first is that even if Christianity were proven false or never existed to begin with, that would in no way undermine the argument. The second is that any kind of objection one has to specifically Christian doctrine will be entirely useless here, meaning that even if the Bible had contradictions in it, or even if Christian moral values were absurd and arbitrary, those sorts of objections simply will not work on this kind of argument. Okay, I think that's enough prologue. What follows is a demonstration of the existence of God. Yay! Imagine you have two distinct objects, which are identical in every way that two distinct objects can be. Now imagine you place these objects on a scale to find that one is heavier than the other. What would you infer from this? Perhaps the objects were not really identical, or perhaps the scale is somehow defective. Regardless of what explanation we give, we instinctively seem to know that there must be some kind of explanation. Whenever we try to solve these sorts of puzzles, we're implicitly using what's called the principle of sufficient reason. Now there's a few different ways we can formulate the principle. For this argument, we'll say that there is a sufficient reason for the being of whatever is and for all attributes of any being. And so this principle would apply not only to the existence of the objects in our analogy, but to their attributes as well, such as how much they weigh. So let's say that the objects were gallons of water. So a gallon of water weighs like a little more than 8 pounds. Let's say one of those gallons weighed 10 pounds, but it was still nothing more than a gallon of water. All things being equal, that would be unintelligible, or what you might call a brute fact. A brute fact is simply something which lacks an explanation. So if the principle of sufficient reason is true, then there are no brute facts. And that means that there's an explanation for either the imbalance in the scale or the weight of the gallon, or however you want to put it. And notice how we intuitively know that there must be an explanation even before we've discovered what that explanation is. And in the cases where we're unable to find an explanation, we simply say we don't know what the explanation is. But we never seem to say that there simply must be no explanation. And so by giving these different solutions to this puzzle, like a defective scale or what have you, we're implicitly presupposing the principle of sufficient reason. The PSR is more evidently true than any argument that could be made for or against it, and so there's no way to even argue against the principle without implicitly using it. Now there's a whole lot more that could be said in defense of the PSR. This is something which permeates throughout your daily life, whether you're conscious of it or not. And there's also a lot of objections that people have raised to the PSR. And so I'll leave links to articles and essays in the information below the video for those wanting a deeper look. And so now that we have our principle, we're going to use it. and we're going to apply it to the existence of the world, which means that if the PSR is true, then the existence of the world must have an explanation. And this would be true regardless of whether you want to think of the world as a universe or a multiverse or whatever. There must be an explanation for it, an answer to the famous question, why is there something rather than nothing? Because what non-arbitrary grounds could we have for saying that this, that, and the other thing must have an explanation, but that the existence of the world doesn't need one? There are 3 objections which may arise at this point. I mean, there's like a ton of objections. I'm just going to answer 3 of them. The first objection says, well, just because the world has an explanation, that doesn't mean that God is the explanation. This is an argument from ignorance, a God of the gaps. Well, the first part of that is true. Just because the world requires an explanation, that fact by itself is not enough to get us to some sort of creator. But note how I never said that God must be the explanation. I mean, we're like a third of the way through the argument. We're not done here yet. And the PSR doesn't say that we can always know what an explanation is. It just says that there always must be an explanation. And so the most I've claimed at this point is that the world has an explanation. The other objection goes like this, and I'm just gonna have to read it off for this one. I'm not gonna try to memorize all this. I mean, if it helps, I can do a dramatic reading. So, even if the world requires an explanation, let me try that again. Even if the world requires an explanation, there are ways in which the world might be able to explain itself. One way is that it could have simply always existed, and each item within the world is explained by each item that came before it and brought it into existence. So let's say a father begets a son, who in turn begets his own son, and so forth, and this chain of fathers and sons go back into the past forever. Each item within the chain would be explained by each thing that came before it, and so everything is accounted for, and there's nothing left to explain. We did it, boys. We explained everything. Now, granted, no one claims that human beings specifically have existed forever, but the same sort of reasoning would be applied to each item within the world, and so a world which has existed forever could explain itself, because each thing would just be explained by the thing that came before it, and then you have an explanation for everything, or so the objection goes. A similar thing people say is that if the world has always existed, then that's just a way it could simply require no explanation. Tomato, tomato. But even if the world has always existed, it would still require an explanation, and it would not be able to explain itself. And that's what we're going to explore in part 2, where I introduce another metaphysical first principle, and yeah, that's it. Okay, see you in part 2.
But he doesn't account for it, first of all, by jumping to the most basic material units of things. He has a more fundamental explanatory apparatus at his disposal, and he uses this term called principle, or in Greek, arche.